Her ID card listed her occupation as secretary, but when the Nazis occupied France, her real job title was shortened from secretary to secret.
I just wanted to write this book so badly because I just fell in love with her. I just fell in love with her character.
At the height of World War II, Marie-Madeleine Fourcade led the largest and most influential resistance group in France, despite the fact that she was young and a woman.
She was not your normal French woman. She had, by all accounts, an amazing aura of authority around her that just made people want to obey her. She was also very charismatic.
The accomplishments of Madame Fourcade's network of spies is impressive, and the dangers they faced gathering their intelligence breathtaking.
She looked on her agents as if they were her own children. So when they were arrested and when she found out that they had been killed, it just devastated her. She talked about, one time she talked about it, it felt like she was wielding an executioner's axe every time she crossed out the name of one of her people. But she kept going. I mean, that's the extraordinary thing, is she kept going.
Now, Marie-Madeleine's unsung heroism is finally being celebrated in a new book that reads like fiction, but is based on fact. It's Madame Fourcade's Secret War.
It's an amazing story.
And you will hear that riveting account directly from the author in this edition of First Person One-on-One with Lynne Olson.
And welcome to St. Louis, and thanks for being with us today.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here.
The French really, they sort of let the Nazis just kind of roll in and take over without much fuss. Why were they so complacent?
There are a lot of reasons for the French, for the incredible quickness in which the Germans conquered France. First of all, you have to remember that France was decimated in World War I. They lost 1.6 million young men. Per capita, probably the worst of any country that fought in World War I. And so they were absolutely determined not to have to go to war again. I mean, the sense of just horror at the idea of facing another war was just endemic throughout the country. And France has always been a very kind of divisive country, politically divisive, and it was tremendously divisive between the wars. They were facing the Great Depression, they were facing Hitler coming to power, and they just were not, they refused to acknowledge the fact that they may in fact have to do this again. And when they were faced with it, they decided, okay, if we're going to have to fight another war, it's going to be like World War I. It's going to be a defensive war. It's not going to be an offensive war.
Well, there was this robust resistance movement. And I have to confess, in reading your book, before that, I was picturing, I don't know, people down in little tunnels in the ground, or, you know, almost sort of Hogan's Heroes or something.
Yeah.
These were like corporations. They were so big and so many employees, so to speak.
By 1943, there were lots and lots and lots of resistance networks throughout the country, and they focused on various things. They focused on intelligence, which is what my heroine did, in other words, collecting intelligence, sending it to the British. There were others that focused on sabotage, subversion against the Germans, but so they were all over. And they varied in size. Hers was one of the largest resistance networks in the country.
I'm not sure what circles one would run in to expect to be recruited to lead the resistance, but whatever those are, I don't think she was necessarily running in it. How did they find her?
No, it's quite by happenstance. She married this army officer, had 2 children immediately, decided that he was not for her because he wanted her to be the typical French subservient wife. That wasn't her. And so in her mid-20s, she left him, and he was based in Morocco, and she left Morocco, took her kids, and went to Paris, where she joined this, smart set of young women. She got a job, she did all the things that young women weren't supposed to do in France back then. And then one day in 1936, when Hitler was beginning his threat against Europe, she went to a tea that her brother-in-law and sister were giving, and met 2 military officers, one named Charles de Gaulle, and the other was a major named Georges Lustineau-Lecot. And she caught Lieutenant Lecaux's eye, and he basically recruited. He was he was an intelligence officer, but he was very anti-German, and he knew what the Germans were about to do. And so he recruited her in this kind of quixotic private campaign to learn as much as they could about the German army and the preparations the Germans were making. And so she became, it was kind of an unofficial intelligence network. And so she became part of that. And that continued until the war broke out, and he rejoined the army and was sent to fight. And he was injured. Long story short, he came back, and they went to Vichy, and together began to form this infant intelligence network.
So she's leading this this huge resistance network, one of the largest, if not the largest, in France at the time, as a woman.
Right.
That must have been extremely difficult.
Well, it was extremely unusual. She was the only woman ever to lead a major resistance organization, and she herself was very hesitant when her mentor, who called himself Navarre, his code name was Navarre, said he wanted her to be the deputy, and she said, "But I'm young." She wasn't even 30 years old at that point. And all these military men, are they going to follow me? And he said, yes, they'll follow you. And so that's how she got involved initially. But initially she was very hesitant, because she did think that, you're talking about military guys who, the idea of a woman being in charge is just, anathema. But she was a very unusual woman. She was, again, young, she was beautiful, but she had, by all accounts, an amazing aura of authority around her that just made people want to obey her. She was also very charismatic. I talked to the son of one of her top lieutenants last year, and he said, if you walked into a room and she was there, that's all. You just paid attention to her and nobody else. She just had this. She just had it. And she also was, as his deputy, she trained a lot of these agents. She trained them in how to do what they were doing. She trained them in coding. She paid them. She provided room and board for them. She was the arranger. She was the administrative person. And so they really got to know her, and they got to know how incredibly good she was at this job, despite the fact that she was a woman. And so little by little, by the time she actually did become the leader, especially the younger ones, they trusted her. They believed that she was the chef. She was the chief.
Were there times when her being a woman was actually an advantage as far as creating some sort of deception?
I think so, yeah, especially in the beginning. Because the Germans came from the same kind of traditional conservative society that the French came from, they also had trouble accepting the idea that women could be spies or saboteurs or whatever. So women, especially young, pretty women, had an advantage, because at least, again, in the beginning, that changed. But in the beginning, the Germans, just thought there's no way that they could be trouble, so they could get away with a lot more than others men could.
Paint a picture of just how big this network was, and they moved around a lot. Obviously, they
yeah,
had to.
Yeah. It started out small, but it spread. It started in the south of France, which was called the Free Zone. That was Vichy France. It was supposedly free because the Vichy government, the legal government of France, was in charge. But in fact, the legal government of France was being controlled by the Germans, and the Germans tightened the screws more and more and more. But at least initially, it was not as, for the resistance, it was not as fearsome as in the north, in the occupied part of France, which included Paris. So it started in southern France, and that's where the first set of agents came from. But soon it spread throughout the country. It was in every part of France, in every major city, in every medium-sized town. Basically there were about 3,000 agents, which is really large. And I have to stress that these were not professional. They weren't professional spies. Most of them were just ordinary people, people that might have access to information about the Germans, but weren't trained to do this. So in other words, like shipyard workers, bus drivers, fishermen, housewives, plumbers, artists. I mean, it ran the gamut. And they were doing it because they wanted to get their country back, and they wanted to get the Germans out, and they knew the risks they were taking. But that's what's so amazing to me, is that they accepted those risks, which were fearsome, and kept going.
Yeah, as I was reading the book, one thing that kept occurring to me, I was sort of asking myself and wondering if readers, and perhaps even the author, ask themselves this as you do it, is, would I do this?
Exactly.
Could I really do this if I was put in that position?
What do you think? Do you think you could do it?
I don't know.
I'm not sure I could. I mean, you are putting everything at stake. You are putting not only your own life and your livelihood, but your families, the people around you. I mean, the dangers and the risks were so overwhelming that I'm amazed at how many people who took those risks. They weren't a lot. I mean, if you look at the French population as a whole, most French people did not resist. And, quite frankly, how can you blame them? But more than 200,000, probably well over that 200,000, did take that risk. And many lost their lives as a result. I mean, it's extraordinary.
Well, and there were times when, I mean, ultimately the organization was successful, but it was almost decimated
It was decimated almost decimated over and over and over again. And it was she who kept it together. She kept cobbling it together, whole sectors, for example, the whole sector in Marseille is wiped out, or, in Vichy or in Bordeaux, or, and she kept finding people to go in and resurrect it. And it was really emotionally traumatizing for her, because she was very close to the people. She didn't know all 3,000, but she knew a lot, and she was very, very close to the people that she was surrounded by. And it was agonizing for her. She looked on her agents as if they were her own children. I mean, there was a really very strong family atmosphere in that network. And so when they were arrested and when she found out that they had been killed, it just devastated her. She talked about, one time she talked about it felt like she was wielding an executioner's axe every time she crossed out the name of one of her people. But she kept going. I mean, that's the extraordinary thing, is she kept going.
And the group kept running around, she kept running around. One of the things, I guess, that she had going for her, perhaps because she was a woman, was she became this sort of master of disguise.
Yes. She changed her hair coloring many, many times. She had various false identities. She even had, various, they didn't change her face, but prosthetics, like a dental prosthetic that she would put in to look like somebody else. She would wear glasses that would make her very unattractive when she was really a beautiful woman. And so I think that helped a lot in her being able to elude the Gestapo until 1944, when she was captured by them and it looked like she wasn't going away.
Not much was known about her, and perhaps even about Alliance, until your book was put together. But of all the things that we should know, is some of the things that they accomplished during their reconnaissance. Some significant things, particularly with regard to D-Day.
Yeah, there were really. Well, as you say, there were so many contributions that they made in terms of the intelligence that they gave to the British. Three in particular. One was finding out a lot about the German submarines that were decimating the British merchant shipping, and it was vital for the British to know when the submarines were leaving the ports and when they came back, etc. And she had a lot of people in the various submarine ports on the coast, the Atlantic coast, who were reporting, and thanks to them, many submarines were sunk by the British, which is hugely important. She also she had agents who found out a lot about the V2 and V1 terror weapons that Hitler used on England. the intelligence they sent didn't stop them, but they were able to delay them. When the British got this information, they were able to bomb, the experimental station, and so they delayed the building and the use of those bombs, which was incredibly important. But as you said, one of perhaps the most important intelligence they gave was had to do with D-Day. Alliance had a subnetwork in Normandy with a number of agents, and obviously they didn't know where the Allies were going to land. Nobody knew except the Allied planners. But this particular subnetwork, in fact, worked on the beaches where, in fact, the Allies did land. And the leader of that network, subnetwork, was an artist, and he put together, thanks to his own intelligence gathering and the intelligence gathering of the people around him, he drew a 55-foot-long map showing every gun emplacement, every beach obstacle, every machine gun nest, every road on Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, and the beaches that the Canadian forces landed on. And you can just, a 55-foot map, that's hugely long and detailed. And it was sent in a huge burlap sack in March 1944, smuggled out of France, taken to England. And so the planners had it 3 months before D-Day. And 2 mornings after it left, the map was sent, this artist and the people that worked with him were arrested by the Gestapo. And on the morning of D-Day, just as the guns were beginning to sound, the Allied guns, signaling the start of the invasion, they were taken out and killed by the Germans.
So little was known about Madame Fourcade prior to your book. I'm wondering how you got the information that you were able to come up with.
I got the idea for her from my previous book, the book I wrote right before it, which was a much bigger topic. It was about the countries of occupied Europe, and I focused a lot on the resistance movements in those various countries. And I came across her, just mentioned briefly in books and journals and other resources. And she is in the previous book, but only a couple of paragraphs. I was just so fascinated by her, and I thought, why don't I know anything about her? Why don't any of the histories of French resistance go into greater detail about her? She wrote a memoir, which I later read, but the history books about the resistance don't really talk about her. So I thought, my goodness, she deserves a book of her own. So that's why I wrote it.
As part of your research, were you able to talk to any of her relatives, descendants?
I talked to her daughter, the daughter that was born after the war, who was the one who talked about her mother not being all that maternal, but she also talked about how Marie-Madeleine, it was so important for her to stay close to the people that she had worked with during the war, and the survivors. Not all of them, obviously. There were hundreds of survivors, but those that she had been closest to would get together every month, and they would go out to dinner, and they would do, and their children remained very close to each other. So her children, her surviving children, are very, very close to the children of her top lieutenants and others. I mean, they're like brothers and sisters. I mean, it really was a family to her. And she spent most of the time after the war in helping the survivors emotionally, materially, economically. She badgered the French government to give them, pensions, etc. And she also helped the wives and the children of those who had died, and spent a lot of her own money on doing that. So she felt really responsible for these people and what had happened to them.
Is there a sense of satisfaction for you, having written this book, that you are bringing some attention to her story that had so long been ignored?
Oh, a tremendous sense of satisfaction. Yeah. I like to write about unsung heroes in my books, and she certainly is an unsung hero. I think one of the reasons she slipped into the shadows is because she was a woman. I mean, the French resistance was just as sexist as the rest of French society, and the male leaders, and they were all male except for her, really didn't want women to be in high positions in their organizations. They were the leaders, and the women were supposed to do the subordinate work, like being couriers and being liaison agents. Those jobs were incredibly important, and they were incredibly dangerous. But those women never really got the credit that the men did. And after the war, well, actually during the war, General de Gaulle and the Free French created this organization of heroes. It's called the Compagnons de la Libération, and it was supposed to be the major heroes of the French resistance. And there were 1,038 chosen. That's the number of the several hundred thousand people who were in the resistance. 1,038 were judged to be heroes. And of that number, 1,032 were men. 6 were women. And she was not included among the women. So, I think it has a lot to do with her gender, that she is not better known. And I want to give her the credit she deserves, and I think I have.
Lynne Olson, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. She saw bemedaled Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe officers dining on the best food and wine that Maxime's had to offer. As she passed them, she thought of her shabbily dressed agents, who often had little to eat, risking their lives to get rid of the men in that elegant room. Marie-Madeleine took a secret delight in the appreciative stares directed at her and Nellie. What would these Germans say if they knew she was leading a network that was plotting their destruction?